President Trump paid El Salvador $6 million to house 252 Venezuelan migrants in what's being called a forced disappearance. And they were housed in the country's notorious terrorism confinement center, or CECOT, for 4 months.
Well, they were supposed to be there for the rest of their lives. The Salvadoran government has said the only way to get out of it is inside a coffin.
And the migrants, most of whom did not have any criminal history, were released last week and then sent back to Venezuela as a part of a prisoner trade with the U.S. And so now the first details of these psychological, physical, and even sexual abuses of what these migrants went through at CECOT are finally coming out, and it's truly inhumane.
Yeah, literally started the second they arrived. They were cut off from the outside world and could have no contact with their families or even legal representation.
Some of their families had no idea where they had gone for months. So one migrant who was a barber in Texas said that his alien identification number just disappeared from the site, and that's what's used to track detainees in the U.S. immigration system, so nobody could find where he was.
And the greeting they got from the prison guards was, "Welcome to hell, where you will live out the rest of your lives and be condemned." And then they were forced to kneel on the ground as officers shaved their heads and confiscated all of their belongings, including their jewelry and their money. And then this group of the Venezuelans were taken to a wing called Module 8, which means they were completely isolated from everybody else in the prison.
They were then taken to cells that contained up to 80 men. So just imagine they were all cramped there together, sleeping on metal bunk beds without any mattresses. And one prisoner said that he slept in a seated position for 4 months.
And they were served the same meatless meals every day, which they said they just weren't given enough food. And they were only allowed to shower once a day at 4 a.m. And there were no walls to separate the bathing areas from the toilet or the rest of the cell. So there was no privacy. Like, everything was visible to everyone.
And then, of course, what's flagging human rights violations and outrage all around the world are the reports of brutal physical torture that took place. So the prisoners would be beaten for talking, complaining about conditions. A 22-year-old prisoner said that he was hit so hard that he lost half a molar and then wasn't given any painkillers for a month. And then for more severe beatings, prisoners were sent to a punishment cell called La Isla, or the Island, which is a dark room with no water or ventilation.
And from their accounts, it sounds like beatings were just regular occurrences. There's a haunting quote: "We got a beating for breakfast, we got a beating for lunch, and we got a beating for dinner." But then it sounds like they ramped up if they were being punished. Like, there was an incident of several inmates trying to break out of their cell, and they said they were punished with 6 days of intense beatings, including being punched, kicked, and struck by clubs. And then on the last day, the male guards brought in the female guards to strike them while they were naked, as the male guards recorded on their phones and laughed. And no wonder they weren't given medical attention, because apparently the prison nurse was watching this horrific beating and shouted, "Hit the piñata." Some inmates vomited blood, others fractured bones, and others said they couldn't walk for days.
I mean, that's literally insane, and things clearly just got so bad. The inmates were desperate for something to change, so a lot of them partook in hunger strikes, and this was crazy, even blood strikes, so that the beatings would stop. So first-hand accounts said that some inmates removed clamps from the cell's piping or corners of their metal bunks to cut themselves, and then they smeared blood on the walls and wrote the letters SOS and "We are not terrorists, we are migrants."
And they said the blood strike worked because 3 or 4 days after the strike started, 2 prison directors came in to negotiate that they would stop the beatings if the inmates would stop the strike. But then a few inmates refused to have their cells inspected, so the guards started beating them again and even shot them with pellets.
And it's important to remember that while all of this is going on, none of the prisoners were actually given trials. So Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act in March. We're sure you all remember talking about whether that was legal or not. And basically, it gave the government the right to pick these people up from their homes or parking lots and without due process convict them of belonging to the criminal gang Tren de Aragua. But investigations showed that less than 10% of the prisoners had criminal past and were sent to CECOT simply for having tattoos that resembled those gang tattoos. There was no other proof for them to be sent there.
It seems so unjust to even just detain people over such little evidence, much less send them to this foreign torture prison. So CECOT is considered the crown jewel of El Salvador's aggressive anti-crime strategy. It's a maximum security mega prison. It was built 2 years ago specifically to house gang members. And you might recognize the name CECOT because that was where the wrongfully deported Kilmar Abrego Garcia was sent, and we all followed that whole saga. And no one knows exactly how many inmates are being held in CECOT because the Salvadoran government doesn't release that information, but it does have the capacity to hold up to 40,000.
I mean, it is a crazy place. Apparently 400 prisoners had already died since CECOT opened less than 2 years ago. But other than that, there's very little known about it. Apparently all of the media tours there are staged by the president. So what goes on there is like very under wraps. There are reports of even prison guards putting like mattresses on bunks or giving prisoners extra food when there are visitors there, or like photos being taken, so that the prison has a really good reputation before it's all taken away again. So these recent accounts detailing all of the conditions are really important.
Well, one account that's getting a lot of attention right now, and understandably so, is Andre Hernandez Romero, who's a 32-year-old gay makeup artist. He's from Venezuela, but he was living in the U.S. under asylum. He wasn't given a trial, and he doesn't have a criminal record. And like the others, the only justification for him being sent to CECOT is because his tattoos kind of look like or similar to gang tattoos. And he alleges he was forced to perform oral sex on at least one of the prison guards. His quote is, "I was sexually abused by the same Salvadoran authorities who guarded us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week." And that really paints a picture of how violating this is. Like, you're being protected and watched at all times by your abusers.
And so now, after this prison swap, Venezuela, rightfully so, is opening a formal investigation into several Salvadoran officials, including the president. So far, the Salvadoran government hasn't publicly addressed the torture allegations. All they said is that this exchange was a diplomatic victory.
Well, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security hasn't commented on these disturbing new allegations, but they have doubled down on their claims that these men are gang members without providing evidence like usual. DHS Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin said, "Once again, the media is falling all over themselves to defend criminal illegal gang members."
And then Marco Rubio, in a statement, said, "Every wrongfully detained American in Venezuela is now free and back in our homeland." So clearly being wrongfully detained matters in some cases. Also, interestingly, we found out that one of the 10 Americans in this prison swap is a legit murderer. So he killed 3 people in Spain and is now free to roam in the US. So
awesome. Well, the Human Rights Watch said it's like Guantanamo on steroids. These people are outside the U.S. in a country with no separation of powers. They're in a space essentially ungoverned by law. So we are talking to the director of the Americas Division of Human Rights Watch, Juanita Gobertas Estrada, to learn more about the legal humanitarian violations that have been potentially committed by the Trump administration by sending these migrants to CECOT.
Can you help us understand what makes CECOT so dangerous and so different from other prisons?
The Salvadoran prison system that we have researched for more than 3 years has been characterized by incommunicado detention, ill treatment, lack of access to adequate medical supplies, lack of access to adequate food. SECOT has been used by President Bukele as his propaganda strategy, and now by President Trump himself and his government to try to show these horrific conditions with a lot of pride, to be able, supposedly, to deter supposed alleged criminals in El Salvador and deter, in the case of the U.S., migrants.
Have you at the Human Rights Watch discovered anything about the conditions or practices that just has stunned you?
So we're starting to interview some of the people that have been released and that are now in Venezuela. What we're starting to hear is really, really worrisome. No access to drinkable water. People describing that you could even see not only the color, but even sometimes worms in water that was supposed to be the ones that they would drink under very severe heat in the cells. Punishment cells in which people that supposedly misbehaved were taken and where others could hear their screaming while they were being beaten. We're in the process of corroborating all of this information.
We're glad that you mentioned corroborating the story, because a lot of people have been mentioning that no outlet or human rights group has been able to verify the claims of abuse yet. Do these accounts sound consistent with what you're confirming?
They do, because the government has declared for now 3 years a state of emergency, suspending due process and basic guarantees that have led the Bukele administration to detain more than 86,000 people, including 3,300 children. We are making the connections between what we're collecting now in the case of SECOT and a lot of the patterns that we have seen in the Salvadoran prison system throughout these years.
And connecting that to the U.S. government, most of these migrants didn't have a criminal history, and they weren't even given a trial before they were sent to CECOT. And I think a lot of us are asking, how is this even possible?
To lay the ground of what the U.S. government has as an obligation. Of course, there's no human right to open borders, but there's a very clear obligations that the the US government does have, and that in these cases have been very clearly violated. People have a right, an asylum claim, if they believe that they have been persecuted. These were people that had been politically persecuted by the Maduro regime in Venezuela that were fleeing that persecution. And they never had a chance by the US government to present that asylum. And then the second obligation is that the US government cannot send people back to a place where they can be tortured.
We know Trump is kind of using this Alien Enemies Act, which is, as we understand, this was not the purpose of its creation. So do you think he's using this improperly to like deport these migrants?
Certainly a misuse. This is a law that was designed in principle for a state of war, which is certainly not the case in the US. So interpreting the Foreign Aliens Act without understanding that the US does have these obligations regarding migrants that are fleeing persecution, that could fear torture, it goes against its own international obligations.
And we've seen recent reports of the Trump administration sending migrants to countries like South Sudan. So what do you think this practice of sending migrants that might even be criminals to third countries?
So the whole idea of a safe third country originally was the idea that if the US wants other country to actually evaluate if that person has a real asylum claim, it can send people to a safe third country. For example, a safe third country was considered Canada, which makes sense. What happens in these cases is that these are not safe countries. They were detained and kept incommunicado, in full detention, without any possibility of filing an asylum claim.
Why do you think the Trump administration is sending them to these third countries in detention centers instead of building more in the US and sending them to Alligator Alcatraz?
The propaganda operation of sending people, Venezuelan migrants, to SECOT, the way it was televised, the way ill treatment was exposed. It was not covered. The idea was for it to be known, displayed. And for me personally, it's very clear that terrorizing migrants is the strategy by the Trump administration to assure that people don't migrate.
That's a really important element, and it's something I think so many people forget. But there's other people who say that's where they belong and that they're criminals and they're terrorists. So what would you say to people saying this is what they deserve?
We've spoken with a lot of migrants because of our field work. Are really people trying to build a new life. These are people that have been harassed by organized crime in Ecuador and told them that either they flee from their homes and pay the extortion, or their whole family is going to be killed. These are people, women that have faced repeated gang rape in Haiti, trying to protect their young girls from experiencing exactly the same. That's the majority of migrants that have attempted to go through a terrible journey. It reminds them of the same kind of violence that they have experienced back home, with the small window of hope that they could actually reach a country in which they could build a new life.